In the quiet little town of Lakeview, Texas, there lived a woman who had spent most of her life surrounded by nature. Her name was Maggie, and she wasn't someone who craved attention or fancy things. She was happy with what she had: a small cabin on a big piece of land right next to a beautiful lake. This wasn't just any land. It had been in her family for generations. Her grandparents used to farm here. Her dad fished in the lake, and now Maggie found peace walking through the tall oak trees and watching birds flit around. The property meant everything to her. It wasn't about money or pride, it was home. Every corner held memories. The spot where she'd sit and read books as a teenager, the old dock where her father taught her how to fish, and even the wildflowers that bloomed every spring. For years, this place gave her comfort, especially after retiring from teaching school kids. But life has a way of changing when you least expect it. One sunny afternoon, while Maggie was tending to her vegetable garden, a car pulled up outside her gate. Out stepped two men in sharp suits, carrying clipboards and looking far too formal for such a peaceful setting. They introduced themselves as representatives from something called Clearwater Estates, a group that wanted to build luxury condos near the lake. At first, Maggie didn't pay much attention. People came and went, making offers for her land all the time, but she always said no. Why would she sell her sanctuary? But these men were persistent. Over coffee at her kitchen table, they laid out their proposal. "We want to buy half your land," one of them explained. "Just 50 acres. We'll leave the rest untouched, and we'll make sure nothing ever happens to it." To sweeten the deal, they promised her financial security, something she desperately needed after racking up medical bills during a tough year. Reluctantly, Maggie agreed. She figured if she kept 10 acres for herself, she could still enjoy her favorite parts of the property. Plus, the money would help ease some of her worries. What Maggie didn't realize was that Clearwater Estates wasn't planning to stick to their word. Within weeks, bulldozers arrived, tearing down not only the agreed-upon 50 acres, but creeping further into her beloved woods. Trees fell, soil was churned up, and before she knew it, 66 shiny new condos stood where once there had been deer trails and bluebonnets. The HOA claimed legal loopholes let them expand beyond what they'd promised, leaving Maggie feeling betrayed and powerless. Furious, Maggie avoided the newcomers moving into the condos. She saw them hosting barbecues, playing frisbee on freshly laid grass, and admiring the view of the lake. But she couldn't bring herself to talk to them. Instead, she retreated to her cabin, nursing her anger and frustration. What hurt the most was knowing that her family's legacy, the land that had shaped her entire life, was being erased bit by bit. As flood season approached, whispers started spreading among the locals. Everyone in Lakeview knew the risks of building too close to the water. Heavy rains often caused the reservoir to overflow, flooding low-lying areas. Maggie's land had always acted as a buffer zone, soaking up excess water like a sponge thanks to its dense vegetation and gentle slope. But now, with concrete foundations replacing tree roots and asphalt sealing off the earth, things felt different. Locals warned each other that the new development might not survive the coming storms. Maggie listened quietly to these conversations, sitting on her porch with a cup of tea. She remembered stories her grandfather used to tell about the Great Flood of '74, when the lake swallowed entire neighborhoods whole. Back then, people learned to respect the power of nature. But Clearwater Estates seemed blind to history. Their condos sat dangerously close to the waterline, and their drainage systems looked poorly designed at best. Despite her resentment toward the HOA, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling of unease growing inside her. Something told her that this upcoming flood season wouldn't be ordinary. And deep down, she wondered whether the newcomers truly understood what they were up against, or if they'd learned the hard way. For now, though, Maggie stayed silent. She watched the skies darken and the wind pick up, waiting to see what nature had in store. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for sure: the land always had the final say. As the weeks turned into months, life in Lakeview began to change. The condos at Clearwater Estates quickly became the talk of the town. People driving by couldn't help but notice how modern and sleek they looked against the backdrop of the lake. For the newcomers, it was a dream come true. They had paid top dollar for these homes, lured by promises of luxury living with breathtaking views. Kids played on manicured lawns, couples strolled hand in hand along paved pathways, and weekend parties spilled out onto patios overlooking the water. But not everyone was thrilled. Maggie, who lived just a stone's throw away, felt a growing sense of dread every time she saw the development. From her cabin, she could hear laughter and music drifting over from Clearwater Estates late into the night. It wasn't the noise that bothered her, it was the arrogance. These people didn't understand the land like she did. They hadn't grown up watching the seasons shift or learned the rhythms of the lake. To them, this place was just another address, a status symbol. But Maggie knew better. She'd seen what happened when humans tried to bend nature to their will. The first warning came in early spring, as it always did. Dark clouds rolled in, and the air grew heavy with moisture. Rain began to fall, not the gentle drizzle you might expect, but sheets of water that pounded the ground relentlessly. At first, no one paid much attention. Spring showers were normal around here. But this storm lingered, day after day, until the reservoir started to swell. Water levels rose faster than anyone anticipated, creeping closer to the edge of the lake. Maggie watched it all unfold from her porch. Her own property sat higher up, protected by the natural slope of the land. Decades of untouched soil and deep-rooted trees helped absorb the rain, keeping her cabin dry. But down below, at Clearwater Estates, things weren't so rosy. The developers had ignored the importance of those trees and roots, replacing them with concrete and asphalt. Now, the water had nowhere to go. It didn't take long for problems to surface. Puddles formed in parking lots, growing larger by the hour. Gutters overflowed, spilling muddy water onto freshly paved streets. Then the retaining walls, the ones meant to hold back the lake, started to buckle under the pressure. Residents noticed cracks forming overnight, jagged lines snaking across the smooth surfaces. Some condo owners called the HOA, demanding answers. Others posted worried messages in community chat groups. But the board dismissed their concerns, assuring everyone that everything was fine. They said the engineers checked everything. One woman told her neighbor nervously, "They promised us this wouldn't happen." Maggie, meanwhile, kept her distance. She avoided the panicked phone calls and frantic meetings happening down at the clubhouse. Instead, she spent her days observing the changes from afar. She saw how quickly the water pooled near the condo's entrance, turning the once pristine driveway into a shallow river. She noticed how the soil around the foundation seemed to soften, shifting under the weight of the structures above. And she heard the whispers from locals, who muttered about karma catching up with Clearwater Estates. One evening, as lightning lit up the sky, Maggie stepped outside to check on her garden. The rain was relentless, drumming against the roof and soaking the earth. She grabbed an umbrella and walked down to the edge of her property, where the condos loomed just beyond the tree line. Standing there, she could feel the tension in the air. The lake was restless, its surface churning with energy. Even from a distance, she could see water seeping into basements and garages, ruining carpets and furniture. Lights flickered inside. Some of the homes, evidence of power outages caused by flooded transformers. Back at her cabin, Maggie dried off and made herself a cup of tea. She flipped through an old photo album, reminiscing about the way the land used to look before Clearwater Estates arrived. There were pictures of her father fishing off the dock, her mother tending to flower beds, and even a faded snapshot of her grandparents standing proudly in front of the original homestead. Looking at those images filled her with both warmth and sadness. This land had shaped her family's story, and now it was being erased piece by piece as the storm raged on. Maggie found herself thinking about the people living in those condos. Sure, they'd ignored her warnings and disrespected her land, but they were still human beings with families and dreams of their own. She wondered if any of them realized yet that they'd been sold a pretty picture that couldn't withstand the realities of nature. Would they learn from this experience, or would they simply blame someone else when things went wrong? By the third day of nonstop rain, the situation at Clearwater Estates had escalated. Water breached the retaining walls entirely, flooding entire sections of the development. Cars floated in driveways, their headlights submerged. Furniture bogged. In swimming pools and muddy streams flowed through living rooms. Emergency crews struggled to reach the area, blocked by washed-out roads and fallen trees. Panic set in as residents scrambled to save what they could, loading valuables onto boats or carrying them to higher ground. Through it all, Maggie stayed put. She didn't gloat or cheer at the chaos unfolding below. Instead, she felt a strange mix of emotions: anger at the HOA for ignoring common sense, sorrow for the families losing their homes, and a deep respect for the power of nature. This wasn't revenge, it was consequence. The land was speaking loud and clear, reminding everyone who truly called the shots. Late that night, as the rain continued to pour, Maggie sat by the fire, listening to the distant hum of generators and the occasional shout from below. She thought about her grandfather's stories again, about the great flood of '74 that wiped out entire neighborhoods. Back then, people rebuilt smarter, respecting the lessons nature had taught them. But Clearwater Estates had skipped that step altogether, charging ahead without regard for history or science. They should have listened, Maggie whispered to herself, staring into the flames. You can pave over paradise, but you can't pave over physics. Outside, the storm showed no signs of letting up. The lake continued to rise, inching closer to the heart of the development. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more heartbreak, and maybe, just maybe, a chance for redemption. By the fourth day of relentless rain, Clearwater Estates was unrecognizable. What had once been a gleaming symbol of luxury now looked like a disaster zone. Water surrounded the condos on all sides, turning parking lots into murky ponds and streets into rivers. The retaining walls, which were supposed to protect the development from flooding, lay in ruins, their concrete chunks scattered like broken promises. Inside the homes, chaos reigned. Furniture floated in living rooms, carpet squished underfoot, and the smell of mildew filled the air. Maggie watched it all from her cabin, perched safely above the rising waters. She hadn't ventured down to see the damage up close. She didn't need to. From her porch, she could hear the sounds of desperation, generators sputtering, voices shouting, and the occasional wail of frustration or fear. Boats shuttled back and forth between the flooded condos and higher ground, rescuing families who'd been caught off guard by the speed of the flood. Some residents clung to whatever possessions they could carry, while others simply stood in shock, staring at what used to be their dream homes. The HOA board members, who had spent months boasting about the foolproof design of Clearwater Estates, were nowhere to be seen. Rumors circulated that they'd fled as soon as the water started creeping into their own offices. Without leadership, panic spread quickly among the residents. People argued over who was responsible for the mess, pointing fingers at the developers, the engineers, and even each other. Tempers flared and tensions ran high. It was clear that no one had anticipated this kind of catastrophe when they signed up for lakefront living. Late one night, As the storm showed no signs of letting up, Maggie heard a knock at her door. At first, she thought it might be the wind, rattling the wood, but then came another knock louder this time. She grabbed a flashlight and opened the door cautiously. Standing there, drenched and shivering, was a man wearing a soaked suit jacket. His face was pale, his eyes wide with urgency. He introduced himself as a representative from the HOA, though Maggie recognized him immediately. She'd seen him before, standing proudly at ribbon-cutting ceremonies and shaking hands with condo buyers. "Please," he said, his voice trembling, "we need your help." Maggie crossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe. "My help?" she asked, her tone flat. "For what?" He explained that the water levels were still rising, threatening to engulf the entire development. Emergency crews had tried everything to divert the flow, but nothing worked. Now, they wanted permission to dig trenches through Maggie's land, to redirect some of the water away from the condos. They promised it would only take a few hours and swore they'd repair any damage afterward. Maggie listened silently, her expression unreadable. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the way his hand shook as he pleaded with her. Part of her felt a pang of sympathy for the people losing their homes, for the children huddled in boats waiting to be evacuated, but another part of her couldn't forget how the GHO had treated her land, how they'd ignored her warnings and pushed ahead without regard for the consequences. "You should have thought about this before you tore down my trees," she said finally, her voice steady but firm. "You built too close to the water, and now nature is doing exactly what I told you it would. This isn't my problem, it's yours." The man stammered, trying to argue, but Maggie cut him off. "I'm not saying this out of spite," she continued. "I'm saying it because someone has to remind you that you can't fight nature. You can't pave over a buffer zone and expect it to keep working like it always did. That land was protecting all of us, not just me." Defeated, the man turned and trudged back toward the flooded condos, his shoulders slumped. Maggie closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. She knew her decision wouldn't make her popular, but it wasn't about popularity. It was about principle. If she gave in now, if she let them dig trenches and disrupt her land, they'd never learn. They'd go right back to ignoring the lessons nature had laid out so clearly. That night, the water rose even higher. By morning, it had reached the main floors of several condos, forcing more families to evacuate. Volunteers from Lakeview arrived, with boats and supplies, helping stranded residents get to safety. Some of the condo owners approached Maggie directly, asking for shelter or assistance, but she directed them to the community center instead. Her cabin was small and she didn't have room to house dozens of people. Besides, she knew the town would rally together. It always did during tough times. As the days dragged on, the situation grew worse. Power lines snapped under the weight of falling branches, plunging the area into darkness. Sewage systems backed up, spilling waste into the floodwaters. The stench became unbearable, and health officials warned everyone to stay away from the contaminated water. For many residents, the reality of their predicament hit hard. This wasn't just a temporary inconvenience. It was a total loss. Their homes, their investments, their dreams all gone in a matter of days. Maggie kept tabs on the situation from afar, talking to neighbors and listening to updates on the radio. She learned that insurance companies were refusing to cover most of the damage, citing exclusions for flood-prone areas. Lawsuits began popping up left and right, with angry homeowners suing the HOA and the developers. The board members, who had initially disappeared, resurfaced briefly to issue a vague apology before vanishing again. No one seemed to know where they'd gone, leaving the residents to fend for themselves. Despite the chaos, Maggie noticed something interesting happening. As the crisis unfolded, people started coming together in unexpected ways. Neighbors who barely knew each other before the flood bonded over shared hardships. Strangers offered spare rooms or food to those in need. Even some of the condo owners, who had once dismissed Maggie as an old woman clinging to the past, began to see her in a new light. They realized she'd been right all along, that building so close to the water was a mistake, and that nature couldn't be tamed. One afternoon, as the rain finally began to ease, Maggie decided to walk down to the edge of her property. She wanted to see the damage for herself, to understand the full scope of what had happened. When she arrived, the scene was surreal. The condos looked like islands in a sea of brown water. Boats bobbed in place where cars used to park, and debris floated everywhere, pieces of furniture, toys, clothing. It was heartbreaking to witness, but also strangely poetic. The land had reclaimed what belonged to it, washing away the arrogance of human ambition. Standing there, Maggie spotted a young couple sitting on the roof of their condo, waiting to be rescued. They waved weakly when they saw her, and she nodded in acknowledgement. There was no animosity in her gesture, just a quiet understanding. These people weren't villains. They were victims of poor decisions made by others. And while Maggie couldn't undo what had been done, she hoped they'd take this experience to heart. Maybe, just maybe, they'd think twice before trusting developers who promised them the world without considering the cost. As she turned to leave, Maggie glanced back at the flooded development one last time. The water shimmered in the fading sunlight, almost beautiful in its devastation. She felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, relief, but above all, a deep sense of resolve. This wasn't the end of the story. It was a turning point, a moment when people might finally start listening to the land instead of trying to conquer it. Back at her cabin, Maggie lit a fire and settled into her favorite chair. Outside, the storm clouds began to break, revealing patches of blue sky. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. Nature had spoken, loud and clear. Now it was up to everyone else to decide whether they'd heed the warning or repeat the same mistakes all over again. When the rain finally stopped and the skies cleared, Lakeview was left to pick up the pieces of what had once been Clearwater Estates. The floodwaters began to recede slowly, revealing the full extent of the destruction. What remained looked more like a war zone than a luxury development. Condos that had stood proudly just weeks earlier were now shells of their former selves. Walls caved in, roofs collapsed, and interiors coated with thick layers of mud and mold. Appliances lay scattered across lawns turned into swamps, and personal belongings floated aimlessly in stagnant pools. For Maggie, watching the aftermath unfold felt surreal. She spent hours sitting on her porch, observing the cleanup efforts from afar. Bulldozers rumbled back onto the scene, not to build this time but to tear down what was left. Entire sections of Clearwater Estates were deemed uninhabitable, condemned by inspectors who shook their heads at the hasty construction and poor planning. Insurance adjusters walked around in rubber boots, snapping photos and jotting notes, only to later deliver devastating news. Most claims wouldn't be covered due to exclusions for flood damage. The residents, many of whom had invested their life savings into these homes, were left reeling. Some packed up what little they could salvage and moved away without looking back. Others stayed, determined to fight for compensation or answers or both. Lawsuits erupted like wildfire, pitting condo owners against the HOA, the developers, and even the engineers who had signed off on the faulty designs. Meetings turned into shouting matches, and accusations flew faster than anyone could keep track. The HOA board, already fractured, dissolved entirely as its members disappeared one by one, leaving behind unanswered emails and disconnected phone lines. Amid the chaos, Maggie became an unlikely figure of fascination in Lakeview. Locals whispered about how she'd predicted this disaster long before the first bulldozer arrived. They marveled at how her untouched land had weathered the storm while the condos crumbled under nature's wrath. Some people drove past her cabin just to catch a glimpse of her, curious about the woman who had refused to sell out completely. Eventually, reporters caught wind of the story too. They showed up at her door, microphones in hand, asking for interviews. At first, Maggie turned them all away. She didn't want attention or fame, she just wanted peace. But eventually, she relented, realizing that her voice might help prevent future mistakes. Sitting on her porch with a cup of tea, she spoke softly but firmly, emphasizing the importance of respecting the land. "You can pave over paradise," she told one reporter, echoing words she'd said to herself during the storm, "but you can't pave over physics." Her message resonated far beyond Lakeview. Environmental activists descended on the town, using Clearwater Estates as a cautionary tale about unsustainable development. Documentaries were filmed, articles written, and public forums held, all highlighting the dangers of ignoring ecological balance. Maggie attended some of these events, though reluctantly, always keeping her remarks short and pointed. She wasn't interested in lecturing anyone. She simply wanted to remind people that nature has rules, and those rules exist for a reason. As lawsuits dragged on and insurance battles raged, some condo owners tried to rebuild. But stricter zoning laws, combined with overwhelming public opposition, made it nearly impossible. Local officials, spurred by growing environmental awareness, enacted new regulations aimed at preventing similar disasters in the future. Any attempts to reconstruct Clearwater Estates were met with fierce resistance, not just from Maggie, but from the entire community. People had learned their lesson the hard way, and they weren't about to let history repeat itself. Eventually, the abandoned development was razed entirely. The land sat empty for months, a stark reminder of what had happened. Then, something remarkable occurred. A coalition of conservation groups stepped forward, proposing to turn the area into a protected wetland. Funded by federal disaster relief money and private donations, the project aimed to restore the natural buffer zone that had once existed there. Native grasses were planted, trees were replanted, and wildlife gradually returned. Over time, the scars of Clearwater Estates faded, replaced by a thriving ecosystem that benefited everyone. Maggie watched the transformation with quiet satisfaction. She visited the site occasionally, walking along newly restored trails and listening to birdsong fill the air. It was strange, she thought, how quickly nature could heal when given the chance. Where there had once been concrete and chaos, there was now life and renewal. And though she never admitted it aloud, she felt a sense of vindication, not because she'd been proven right, but because the land had spoken louder than any human argument ever could. Still, Maggie knew this wasn't the end of the struggle. Developers would always come knocking, promising prosperity and progress. Folks would always be tempted by shiny brochures and slick sales pitches. But maybe, just maybe, the story of Clearwater Estates would serve as a deterrent, a reminder that shortcuts don't work when it comes to nature. After all, the lake hadn't changed. Its waters still rose every spring, just as they always had. The difference now was that people were starting to listen. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the water, Maggie sat on her porch reflecting on everything that had transpired. She thought about the families who had lost so much, the anger and frustration they must have felt. She also thought about the resilience she'd seen, the way neighbors helped each other, the way strangers came together in times of need. Despite the tragedy, there was hope. People were learning, however painfully, to live in harmony with the land instead of trying to dominate it. As darkness fell and fireflies began to dance in the twilight, Maggie leaned back in her chair, letting the sounds of the night wash over her. Frogs croaked, leaves rustled, and somewhere in the distance an owl called out. For the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. The battle wasn't truly over. There would always be challenges ahead. But tonight, she allowed herself to rest, knowing that the land had won this round. And sometimes that was enough.